The day everything changed started like any other Thursday. I was driving north on Highway 231 toward a commercial renovation project outside Murfreesboro. Around noon, my supervisor called and redirected me to inspect a site near a lakeside resort about 30 miles off my original route. It was the kind of assignment that barely registered in my mind. Just another stop on another workday. I pulled into a gas station across from the resort entrance to answer a few emails before heading in. That's when I saw the SUV. Claire's SUV. At first, I thought there had to be an explanation. She'd told me she was spending the weekend at a women's wellness retreat in Nashville. The timing made no sense. Neither did the location. I sat there watching. 10 minutes later, Claire stepped out of one of the lakeside cabins. She was smiling. Relaxed. The kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. Then a man walked out behind her. He rested his hand on the small of her back as they headed toward the parking lot. It wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was familiar, comfortable, like a gesture repeated hundreds of times before. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know how long it had been going on. But sitting there behind the steering wheel, watching my wife lean toward another man, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next, I would never walk back into my life as the same man. My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 54 years old, and for most of my adult life, I worked as a commercial electrician. The job kept me moving across Tennessee, from warehouses outside Knoxville to hospital projects near Nashville. I spent long days reading blueprints, running conduit, and solving problems that had clear answers. Wires either connected or they didn't. Systems either worked or they failed. Life at home was never supposed to be that complicated. Claire and I had been married for 22 years. We lived in a quiet subdivision outside Franklin with our 16-year-old daughter, Madison. From the outside, we looked like any other family. We attended school events, hosted backyard cookouts, paid our bills, and talked about college plans. Nothing about our life seemed unusual. Claire worked in marketing for a regional healthcare company. Her position involved conferences, networking events, and occasional travel. At least, that was what I believed. Over the years, her trips became more frequent. There was always another seminar, another leadership retreat, another weekend workshop. I never questioned it because trust had become part of our routine. Looking back, the warning signs weren't hidden. They were simply ignored. Her phone was never far from reach. Messages appeared and disappeared before I could glance at the screen. Credit card charges surfaced in places she never mentioned visiting. Sometimes she returned from business trips with stories that sounded rehearsed, polished in a way that left no room for questions. I noticed these things. The truth is that I noticed all of them. What I didn't do was connect them. Every strange detail came with an explanation, and I accepted each one because the alternative was something I didn't want to consider. It was easier to trust my wife than to investigate the possibility that my entire understanding of our marriage might be wrong. After that afternoon at the resort, I stopped looking for explanations that made me feel better. I didn't confront Claire. I didn't accuse her of anything. When I walked through our front door that evening, I acted exactly the same as I always had. I asked about her retreat. She told me it was relaxing and productive. I listened, nodded, and ate dinner across from her while she described a weekend she had never actually attended. For the first time in years, I paid attention instead of accepting answers. A week later, I started reviewing our bank statements. Charges that once seemed ordinary suddenly stood out. Hotel reservations during supposed conferences. Restaurant bills in cities where no company events had been scheduled. Small purchases made near locations she never mentioned visiting. Each discovery by itself looked harmless. Together, they told a different story. The hardest part wasn't finding evidence. It was realizing how much of it had been sitting in front of me the entire time. I wasn't uncovering something new. I was finally allowing myself to see what had always been there. The pattern became impossible to ignore. And once I saw it clearly, I knew there was no going back to the version of reality I had spent years protecting. The real turning point didn't happen when I saw Claire at the resort. It happened 3 weeks later on a quiet Tuesday evening. We were sitting in the living room after dinner. Madison was upstairs finishing homework, and Claire was scrolling through her phone. The television was on, but neither of us was watching it. I remember looking across the room and realizing I was exhausted. Not angry, not heartbroken, just tired. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. For weeks, I had been thinking about how to save my marriage. Every bank statement, every suspicious trip, every lie I uncovered led to the same question. Could this still be fixed? That night, the question disappeared. I understood something I should have realized much sooner. I was fighting to preserve a marriage that only existed in my memory. The relationship I was trying to save had already been replaced by secrets, distance, and deception. The next morning, before heading to work, I called a divorce attorney and scheduled a consultation. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still left for work before sunrise. I still answered Claire's messages. I still sat at the dinner table each evening and listened to her talk about her day. But inside, something had settled into place. For the first time since the resort, I wasn't searching for answers anymore. I was preparing for what came next. The attorney meeting lasted less than an hour, but it changed the way I looked at everything. He didn't ask me how I felt. He asked for facts, dates, accounts, property records, financial statements. By the time I left his office, I had a checklist instead of a broken heart. That was exactly what I needed. Over the next several weeks, I became a quiet observer of my own life. I copied financial records and stored them securely. I reviewed tax returns. I documented travel dates and expenses. Every piece of information went into a folder that only I knew existed. Meanwhile, Claire continued living as though nothing had changed. She talked about future vacations. She discussed updates to the house. She sent me grocery lists while sitting in airport lounges on trips I no longer believed. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. The anger I expected never arrived. Instead, I found myself paying attention to details. Small inconsistencies became predictable. Excuses repeated themselves. Stories changed slightly each time they were told. The more carefully I listened, the less convincing they became. For years, I had ignored the evidence because I wanted to believe her. Now I was simply recording reality, and reality was becoming impossible to deny. About a month after the resort, Claire told me she needed to attend another marketing conference in Chattanooga. A year earlier, I wouldn't have questioned it. This time, I wrote down the dates. The conference supposedly started on Friday morning and ended Sunday afternoon. A few minutes of research revealed something interesting. The event existed, but registration records showed it had taken place 2 weeks earlier. I stared at my computer screen for several minutes. Not because I was shocked, because I finally had something concrete. No assumptions, no interpretation, just a verifiable lie. That evening, Claire packed a suitcase and kissed me goodbye before leaving. She smiled the same way she always did before work trips. I smiled back. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around the house. Everything appeared normal. Family photos covered the walls. Madison's school schedule was taped to the refrigerator. Claire's coffee mug sat beside the sink. The setting looked unchanged, but my understanding of it had shifted completely. For years, I had trusted words more than evidence. Now the evidence mattered. And the evidence was telling me that the woman I had shared a life with was no longer being honest about where she went, what she did, or who she spent her time with. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was becoming a documented fact. That weekend, while Claire was supposedly attending the conference, I focused on something I had neglected for a long time: my own life. I went to work on Saturday morning and spent the day troubleshooting electrical issues at a distribution center outside Nashville. The work was routine, but there was comfort in it. Every problem had a cause. Every solution could be tested. Relationships weren't like that. By late afternoon, I found myself thinking less about Claire and more about the years leading up to this point. The truth was uncomfortable. The signs hadn't appeared recently. They stretched back much further than I wanted to admit. There had been birthdays interrupted by business trips, anniversaries postponed because of conferences, entire weekends explained away by professional obligations. I had accepted each one because questioning them felt disloyal. Now I saw those memories differently, not as isolated events, but as pieces of a larger pattern. When I returned home that evening, Madison was at a friend's house. The house was quiet. I sat alone in the living room and looked through old photographs on my phone. Somewhere along the way, Claire had stopped being fully present in our marriage. The painful realization wasn't that she had changed. It was that the change had happened so gradually that I barely noticed. And for the first time, I began wondering how much of my life had been built on assumptions instead of facts. Claire returned Sunday evening exactly when she said she would. She carried a conference tote bag, a folder filled with printed materials, and a smile that looked practiced. If I hadn't already known the conference had ended weeks earlier, I might have believed every word she said. Over dinner, she described keynote speakers, networking sessions, and panel discussions. I listened carefully. Several details contradicted information I had already verified online. Names were wrong. Times didn't match. Entire events she described had never taken place. The strange part was how natural the lies seemed. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stumble. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had repeated the story before arriving home. That realization bothered me more than the deception itself. Lying wasn't new anymore. It had become routine. Later that night, after Claire went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and reviewed my notes. Dates, expenses, travel records, verified inconsistencies. The folder continued to grow. I wasn't building a case against her. I was building clarity for myself. For years, confusion had protected the marriage because uncertainty allowed hope to survive. Facts were different. Facts didn't care what I wanted to believe. And with every new fact, the gap between appearance and reality became impossible to ignore. The marriage everyone thought we had existed only on the surface. Underneath it, something entirely different had been happening for a very long time. As my understanding of the situation became clearer, my priorities began to change. A month earlier, I had been focused on saving my marriage. Now I was focused on protecting my future. The attorney advised me to stay patient and avoid unnecessary confrontation. He explained that emotional reactions often create problems that take months to resolve. Facts, documentation, and preparation were far more valuable. I took that advice seriously. One evening, after Claire left the room, I reviewed our financial accounts again. Nothing appeared alarming at first glance, but several transfers between accounts caught my attention. The amounts weren't large enough to attract notice during normal circumstances, yet they happened frequently. I documented everything. At the same time, I became increasingly aware of Madison. Our daughter was preparing for college applications, balancing school, sports, and part-time work. She had no idea what I was uncovering. I intended to keep it that way. Whatever happened between Claire and me, Madison deserved stability. That thought guided every decision I made. The situation was no longer just about betrayal. It was about responsibility. The marriage might be ending, but I still had obligations as a father, homeowner, and provider. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what Claire was doing. I was thinking about what I needed to do next. And that shift changed everything. By the beginning of December, I realized something important. I was no longer waiting for another discovery. For months, I had collected information, verified timelines, and documented inconsistencies. Every new piece of evidence had once felt significant. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. The uncertainty was gone. One cold morning, I arrived at a job site before sunrise and sat alone in my truck with a cup of coffee. The parking lot was empty except for a few contractor vehicles scattered near the entrance. I watched the sky slowly brighten and thought about the previous year. The lies. The explanations. The excuses I had accepted because they were easier than asking difficult questions. What surprised me was the absence of anger. Instead, I felt relief. The constant need to figure things out had disappeared. I wasn't chasing answers anymore because I already had them. When my phone buzzed with a message from Claire about another upcoming work trip, I looked at the screen for several seconds before setting it down. The details no longer mattered. Whether she was telling the truth or lying again changed nothing. My decision had already been made. The attorney had everything he needed. The financial records were organized. The plan was in place. For the first time since seeing her at that lakeside resort, I wasn't reacting to events. I was moving toward a future that no longer depended on her choices. And that felt like freedom.
That's the end of the story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos for you, so pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.